do you think when you think, oh, the foxes are getting cuter?
How could they get any cuter?
You are listening to Urban Wildlife Podcast.
Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of the Urban Wildlife Podcast. Thanks for listening. Please be sure to tell all your friends about the Urban Wildlife Podcast and make sure they listen to it also, and give us great ratings on your podcast listening app of choice. We are part of the Wildlife Observer Network, so please check out all of our Wildlife Observer Network sibling podcasts, and feel free to get in touch with us by email at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. Again, urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com, and feel free to tweet at us at urbwildlifecast.
I'm going to start off by saying quickly, this is Billy Brown, one of your regular co-hosts of the Urban Wildlife Podcast. We should say, Tony, in the time since the last podcast episode, Angie, his wife, had a baby, Azalea, so we wish them the best and, all the great sleepless cocooning time that they're doing right now. And I am joined by two guests who arguably could be called foxes themselves if you were looking at them. We got, and they laugh at my jokes, which is great. We've got, we'll start with Christian. Christian, who are you and what do you do?
I am a professor of political science at Drexel University, and I'm an environmental political theorist by training, and a lot of my recent work has been in a field called human-animal studies, which sort of engages questions of coexistence between species in many different places, in laboratories and zoos and backyards and cities. And so a lot of my work is about how people and wild animals make sense of each other in urban contexts.
Perfect. This is why we should have you on every episode. And then we've got Kate. Kate, who are you and what do you do?
I am Kate Garchinsky. I am an illustrator. Right now, I specialize in narrative nonfiction picture books for kids. And my first book was The Secret Life of the Red Fox, written by Lawrence Pringle. There you go. It is, I think that one's like his 127th book. So he's a veteran, and this is my first book. But I've gone on to do a few more books, and which actually have a theme of things that you see as roadkill, is what I like to call them. You've got skunks, bats. I guess you don't see them as roadkill, but there's like a backyard bird kind of theme.
All right, I've got a lovely osprey book of yours also, which I've never seen those as roadkill. So there you go. You've got all kinds of non-flattened fauna there.
Yeah. Different author.
Okay, well, all right, never mind that guy. Okay, then. No, he's actually also a friend of the podcast, so we got to be cool to the osprey author, Rob Burkhardt.
Rob.
We've had him on talking about osprey before, and actually about barred owls as well. I've been wanting for a while to do an episode about red foxes. Partly it's because, as listeners of this podcast might actually know, I'm really into questions of biogeography, and I'm also interested in questions of, we'll call it evolution of animals that have become urban residents under urban selection pressures. And so this episode's got all of that. And before I jumped in, I wanted to talk a little bit for a few people who might live in cities that don't have foxes or just haven't noticed them. I'll start off with one fox observation, then I'm going to toss it to you guys to hear what you guys think about and what you've seen in terms of foxes in cities. I didn't actually see this particular fox, but there was an article, and I looked it up. It was in an online publication for Philadelphia, I think called Billy Penn, and it was an observation from a few years ago that someone posted on Instagram on April 6, 2015, of a red fox with a dead Canada goose, and the fox is in full defensive posture, ears back, snarling. And my understanding from other people who'd seen this pictures of this and seen the scene, it was sort of defending a dead Canada goose against feral cats at near the Walmart in South Philadelphia on Thomas Boulevard. So that for me was like, this is truly an urban animal living in the city, killing a sort of feral urban goose in some senses, at a cat colony on an old industrial pier next to a shopping center. Kate, do you ever see foxes in urban areas, or have you?
I have. Of course, when I was working on the book, I didn't see any when I needed to see them, but I've seen, we were birding at, we were at John Hines. Brian and I, it was one of our first like daytime dates, and I took him to John Hines, and he had never birded before, and it was getting to be like dusk or right after dusk. Or sunset, and we were walking the trail trying to get out of there before it got too dark, and suddenly, like, we were just like watching a robin on the ground, and suddenly out of nowhere 2 foxes come right through, crossing our path, one chasing the other. We're like, "Woo, that's really exciting," and maybe a good omen for our relationship. I don't know.
Turns out it was.
Yeah, right. I've also seen one at FDR Park that was looking really, really beat up. He could have been hit by a car at some point. He had mange. His tail was like broken off, and it was really sad. Those are my urban fox experiences.
All right, Christian, you are, and I think in Christian's introduction of himself, I always like to point out Christian is also an incredible wildlife photographer who does a lot of photography at Hines and other spots. But and your observation doesn't have to follow that, Christian. I just had to say it. So. What are some?
Thank you. Thanks for the shout out. Yeah. I mean, I shoot foxes at the Hines all the time. They are remarkably wary there, which is interesting. They're not particularly relaxed around people, as you would sort of expect, or as sort of the case in other cities where foxes are common. I also see them in my neighborhood around Brewery Town. There's a railway right-of-way sort of on the edge of the neighborhood in Fairmount Park. And when you go out, after dark or before dawn, seeing foxes is fairly common. And then perhaps the most famous Philadelphia fox, this would have been about 3 years ago, there was a den at the Barnes Foundation Museum on the Parkway.
Oh, really? Somehow I didn't know that. Okay.
That raised her puppies there, yeah.
Wow. I mean, it doesn't get much more center of Philadelphia than that. Okay.
Yeah. So they're all over the city as far as we can tell.
They're also famously urban fauna in European cities. I know in English, in the UK, I get my impression of them is that they're kind of like the raccoons of England, where they're the meso predator kind of animal that you'll find raiding the trash at night. I thought I had this in the podcast. I can't remember. We had a long story. A guy who was from Berlin staying at our house, renting a room for a while. He was a scholar and studying at an institute in Philadelphia. And he was telling me stories. I recorded some, and I thought I put them in the podcast. I couldn't find them. But in Berlin, like late at night, riding his bike home from a club or something like that, and coming across like a fox eating like someone's dropped like kebab, and just sort of had that as like an iconic fox encounter in Berlin.
Yeah, I've sort of asked myself this question. I think because raccoons have sort of occupied those niches pretty effectively in most U.S. cities, I think, I tried to track this down a while ago, and as far as anyone knows, the first sort of urban raccoons were sighted in Cincinnati, of all places, in the 1920s. That seems to have been the epicenter of raccoon urbanization in the U.S. And so, to some extent, I think they sort of, because they preceded foxes and have sort of taken up the spaces, I've always wondered whether that is part of the reason why foxes haven't taken over urban spaces to the same extent that we know they have in Berlin or London or Birmingham or other cities like that, where they seem to be sort of what we associate here with urban raccoons.
The trash pandas of Europe.
Yeah. Well, also in the UK, because all the other mesopredators are gone, right? I mean, there are no lynx, there are no wolves, there are no, they sort of effectively killed off everything else. So foxes it is.
You're anticipating a topic in a few minutes. So I'll use that as I don't know, not exactly a smooth segue, but it'll work in a few minutes. So one of the things I find interesting about foxes, and this is something that I learned when I was actually having a drink with Tony at his house years ago, and I can't remember who else was there. I think Matt Halley or something like that. And they were talking about the documented range expansion of red foxes in the United States. And I just sort of always assumed, I'd lived in Baltimore and seen foxes there. I've been in Philadelphia and seen them here, that they were always here. And it turns out when you look at sources from 150 years ago or so, or longer ago, that the folks then talked about observing their expansion. And so, Kate, are you in a position to read from Audubon and Bachman's Viviparous Quadrupeds of North America?
I am.
All right.
I have it queued up here.
So this is from 1854, and so this is for let's call it the perspective of naturalists who are around to observe some of this expansion. Go ahead.
Yes. So it says red foxes have gradually migrated from the northern to the southern states. This change of habitation may possibly be owing to the more extensive cultivation to which we have alluded on page 265, which I read, and it's all about the improvement of land as people have been settling and bringing in their livestock and their more tame turkeys and whatnot. So we have alluded as a reason for the species having become more numerous than it was before the revolution. This idea, however, would seem to be overthrown by the continued abundance of gray foxes in the eastern states. Not so much anymore. In the early history of our country, the red fox was unknown south of Pennsylvania, that state being its southern limit. In process of time, it was found in the mountains of Virginia, where it has now become more abundant than the gray fox. A few years afterwards, it appeared in the more elevated portions of North Carolina, then in the mountains of South Carolina, and finally in Georgia, where we have recently observed it.
Awesome. And so in a way, like right there, Audubon and Bachman are putting out basically a hypothesis of why foxes ended up where they were, and other guess. I guess the other big guess was that maybe the foxes that were appearing outside of what their earlier range had been were European foxes brought over for hunting. And so I found a paper that was published in 2012 from the Journal of Mammalogy, and it's called the Origin of Recently Established Red Fox Populations in the United States, Translocations or Natural Range Expansions, by, let's see if they do all the authors, Mark Statham, Benjamin Sachs, Keith Aubrey, John Perrine, and Samantha Wisely. And so the study basically compared red fox populations in the United States with populations from Eurasia, looking at them across the range in North America. And through the wonders of modern genetic analysis, they were finding that the ones in the Mid-Atlantic, and the southeast of North America were related to the ones to the north from like the quote original range in the northeast of the United States. And then out west, they found that other areas that they expanded south into, out west, they were a mix of foxes from the northern parts of the West, as well as fox lineages from eastern North America, presumably that escaped from fur farms. So the reason I like talking about this, beyond I think it's cool, is that a particularly hot urban wildlife topic these days, and one that Christian's written a good bit about, are urban coyote, that have kind of done the same thing. So I was going to kick it over to Christian to talk a little bit about this, because this is, I think, of one of your topics.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, we've done a couple of papers about not just urban coyotes, but the sort of people that live with them, their human neighbors, and what people make of the coyotes, and what the coyotes, as best we can tell, make of the people. But the background for all of this is that coyotes, of course, historically, were confined to the southwest of the United States, sort of arid regions, New Mexico, Arizona, and so on, the prairies as well. And once European colonists had effectively extirpated wolves from the continental United States, coyotes were then free to move into those areas. And it seems to have taken them about a century or so, maybe a century and a half, migrating through the upper Great Lakes and across the Mississippi into the eastern U.S. Interesting thing happened along the way in the northern part of the range. Coyotes hybridized with remaining wolf populations, leading to the emergence about 100 years ago of a larger northeastern coyote, sometimes called eastern coyote or the coy wolf. Genetic analysis of these animals suggests that their sort of wolf content genetically is anywhere from sort of 9 to maybe 30 or 40%, depending on part of the country and the individual animal. And they've effectively, they can be found in almost any American city now across the continent. They've become a sort of universal mesopredator. And in some cities, they've been established for decades. Chicago, cities in California, across the Southwest, of course, where they've been for a long time, where it's true, right? When people sort of say the animals have been here first, if you're in Tucson, you're not wrong about coyotes, right? They've been there first. But here, and I think the first animals in Pennsylvania were not recorded until the 1930s, maybe, or the 1940s.
Yeah, I think you're right on the 30s part. I remember talking to a guy at the Game Commission about this.
Yeah, and they've since sort of spread across the state and have been in Philadelphia, apparently, for maybe up to 3 decades. There's sort of some early studies from the late 80s, early 90s.
If Tony were here, he would tell the story of how in the 90s, he saw one after a concert late at night at 6th, well, it's a 2nd and Spruce or 6th and Spruce. But
yeah, no. And then they're definitely fairly common now. They're all over the Wissahickon and the sort of adjoining neighborhoods. They can be found in cemeteries, Roxborough, up there in sort of northwest Philadelphia. They're pretty abundant. You can hear them howl almost every night. So they've expanded across the continent. And people who have historically not had to live with coyotes are now having to figure out how to do that successfully. I
mean, I'll ask what might be a dumb question, but is why don't people like coyotes more than they do? Because I like them a lot.
Yeah, you would think, right? I mean, Americans are crazy about dogs, more so than cats. Coyotes are basically dogs. But a lot of the potential for conflict between people and coyotes actually revolves around domestic dogs. We have pretty good data about encounters that turn, violent, where there's, somebody gets bitten, and the somebody that gets bitten is often your dog. Because coyotes tend to view domestic dogs as competition, particularly in the springtime, during denning season when the pups are born or being cared for, just becoming independent. So that's sort of time from March through maybe this time of year, midsummer. The potential for sort of coyote-dog conflict goes up, and then often the person tries to intervene and protect their dog, and then the person gets bitten. There's a lot of ambivalence, right? Coyotes are like dogs, but they're not like dogs. They certainly can't be controlled in the same way that a domestic dog could be controlled by an owner. So in some ways, they're all the things that dogs are not, right? Or
the anti-dog.
Dog owners look for in their dogs they don't get from a coyote, at least not yet. There's some interesting domestication developments, maybe.
Okay. You're anticipating another topic, but go ahead.
Yeah, so the concerns that people have in cities are, is this a coyote often, right? So what we still see in Philadelphia a lot, when you sort of track this on social media, somebody posts a picture of a wild canid, and is this a coyote? Is this a fox? Is this a runaway dog? What is this thing? So that's still a little bit of a question when people have encounters. They're not quite sure what they're looking at. And then, there's always the question of pet safety, right? To answer your question, foxes, for the most part, will not attack domestic dogs of any size, whereas coyotes occasionally will see smaller dogs as an easy meal, and then sort of carry off a smaller dog and basically eat it. And I think that's clearly where a lot of the anxiety comes from. because not entirely unjustified. I mean, those attacks are very rare, but they happen a lot.
I shouldn't laugh. It's terrible if you really love that dog and it gets snapped away.
No. It's a terrible thing.
Yeah.
I've heard that they have a taste for cats as well.
Yeah, I mean,
That's yeah.
Have a taste for is exotic. I mean, there's some pretty good data from Los Angeles and Coyote and Chicago, where scientists have done sort of long-term diet studies, and for the most part, urban coyotes eat wild prey. Rodents, deer, whatever, roadkill, fruit. I mean, they're omnivores actually, like domestic dogs. They'll just eat just about anything. And yeah, occasionally they'll take a cat, feral cats in particular. But yeah, if you have a sort of unwary house cat that roams around in coyote territory, they're fair game for sure.
And there's research. There's a classic study. I forget the name of it, by two scientists, Crooks and Soule. I never know how to pronounce his last name. But they looked at coyotes moving into previously non-coyote territory in somewhere in Southern California, and found that songbird populations did better after the coyote moved in, and cats became more scarce. And so it was probably not, maybe they killed a few of them, but owners of cats who had previously let them outside maybe kept them closer to home because they were worried about the coyote. And then I remember this from another study in Chicago when they tracked coyotes and cats, that cats, a lot of outdoor cats are smart enough to avoid coyotes. And so coyotes will sort of hang out more in forest or, let's say, park areas. And then you find the cats sort of avoiding those park areas and sticking closer to the urbanized or suburbanized spaces. So there's a bit of a fear ecology dynamic in there also. So do we find, I mean, you guys, and Kate, you've probably seen a lot of this, and, Christian, you're out there a lot too. And how do people feel about foxes? I mean, when we all were keeping chickens on our farms, in some sense, we would have been killing foxes as competition whenever we could, I guess. But here in the city, we don't keep chickens. So when you talk about foxes, or Christian, you're talking to people about your pictures, or Kate about the book. Kate, why don't we start with you? Like, what are attitudes towards foxes like?
Oh, they're so cute. Aw. The babies are they are. I mean, right now we live in an area that borders the rural part of the Philadelphia, greater Philadelphia area. There's actually the oldest hunt club, fox hunt club in the United States is right up the road, the Radnor Hunt. And apparently they used to hunt foxes all around here. They don't do it so much anymore. They just go trotting around and looking fancy. But the foxes here they're not as afraid of people as I expected them to be. They're actually we have one that comes to our bird feeders. Well, we throw peanuts out the window for the blue jays because they demand it. And then if the blue jays don't get all the peanuts, we found that there's a fox who comes regularly and eats the peanuts that are left over. And it's adorable. Like, you see it and it kind of reminds you of a dog. And they also have a cat-like, way about them, the way they hunt and pounce on things and stalk. And then there's the fluffy tail really helps too, I think. Those are my opinions. And they make funny noises. I don't know. They're very sweet in a way. If you don't, see a really mangy one, then you just feel bad.
Christian, how do people, I'll phrase something, maybe Christian will phrase it better. I think when I read Christian's work, a lot of it is looking at how much do humans regard other animals as having a legitimate place in our urban spaces or in spaces that we share with them. And so how do foxes fall into that, do you think?
So I think people don't have a huge problem with foxes. They're concerned about predation of pets and chickens if they do have chickens, right? Obviously, there's some urban chicken keeping where raccoons and foxes become potentially a problem. You have to, make sure your chickens are under lock and key at night. But yeah, I mean, foxes fall outside of this. They're not a threat to people. They're not a threat to children. They may theoretically be, a threat to a kitten. But I don't know that there's enough interactions between the two species to really create a lot of concern. There is, you occasionally see sort of comments where people, if people haven't had any kind of exposure to wildlife, people will sort of will ask questions, right? There's a fox. Should I be concerned? What's going on? Why is it here? So there is, I think, in a lot of people's minds, there's this idea that yes, these animals, foxes, coyotes, raccoons, etc., live in cities, but really they ought to stay in these sort of imagined habitats, or habitats as we imagine them, right? So people think that there's a park or there's a cemetery or some other sort of larger green space, and that's where the fox or the coyote or the raccoon or skunk or whatever belongs. And of course, the animals themselves don't draw those distinctions, right? I mean, they might have sort of home base in the park, but the residential neighborhood next door is also part of the territory. Besides, that's where a lot of the food is, right? Kate mentioned the bird feeder, or the sort of carelessly stored trash, or a fruit tree, right? So people have a little bit of difficulty with this idea that even though we as humans might divide the city into these separate zones, right? Sort of residential neighborhood for people over here, park for the animals over there. The animals themselves have a lot more, obviously more flexible or a different map of what their typical constitutes of territory.
Yeah.
And so this sort of dualism, right, of where nature, non-human nature, is sort of confined to these designated areas within cities, and when animals leave them, that is sometimes experienced as a sort of a form of trespass, right, or a kind of invasion or a violation of a sense of space that a lot of people have. And so we're learning to accept, the fox in your backyard as sort of a normal part of what it means to inhabit a city, is a little bit of a struggle for people, and maybe independently of the species, right? Because people also complain about opossums or, whatever. Squirrels.
Which are the most benign urban animal you can think of. But
yeah. But they don't look that cute, right, to a lot of people.
The cute factor, I think that makes a difference. Yeah.
And while coyote puppies are pretty cute, some of the adults, especially the eastern coyotes, really do look a little bit wolf-like. They're sort of the size of a German shepherd. The males can weigh 60 pounds, 65 pounds maybe. So they're sort of a different kind of league than a smaller fox or raccoon.
Well, then your cute factor is actually, I'm going to follow that segue for sure. So I want to talk a little bit about domestication. I just got a lovely notice from Zoom saying they removed the 40-minute limit. So I don't know that we want to go super long, but it takes a little bit of time pressure off. Thank you, Zoom. I'll start. Then I'll give more of an introduction to domestication than I originally meant to. So when we talk about domestication, I think when I was a kid, I think a lot of people years ago had the idea that like domestic dogs are descended from wolves. That meant that at some point our our hunter-gatherer ancestors in Asia or Europe, kidnapped a bunch of wolf puppies and took them into the tent, and that is, I think, falling out of favor in favor of the idea that that the animals that we think of as domestic animal, or at least some of the animals we think of as domestic animals, cats and dogs in particular, are animals that found it convenient to live around people, got used to living around people, especially dogs, evolved to better perceive our intentions and to not be threatening. And probably were basically just eating our trash. And then that's sort of how they got into our settlements, and then they got into our homes. It's a much shorter jump than kidnapping wolf puppies, And so and so that's sort of like the old story about dogs and cats. So that's sort of when I'm about to talk about things being like we'll see this term domestic syndrome or domestication. That's the process we're thinking of. More broadly, something I'm seeing more and more as research is how urban conditions select for features that help animals live in cities. And this should be like blindingly obvious when we think about evolution, that if you have a certain landscape, like urban landscapes with certain kinds of conditions, of course that'll select for different things than what animals evolved with out in the countryside before there were cities. And an example that I like to think of, because it's a reptile and amphibian example, there are small lizards called anoles that there's hundreds of species of them that live throughout like the Caribbean and parts of Latin America. And in Puerto Rico, there's a kind of anole that has been documented in cities apparently having evolved different different length feet and legs that are better for climbing on concrete rather than climbing in bushes. And so the thinking is that they're responding to what they have to climb on in cities, and the ones that are better at climbing on concrete survive more than the ones that are better at climbing on bushes. And so a paper that a friend shared with me, David Hewitt, I should give him a shout out. Dave Hewitt sent me a paper that came out this past June in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B. It's got the sexy title called Skull Morphology Diverges Between Urban and Rural Populations of Red Foxes, Mirroring Patterns of Domestication and Macroevolution. And it's by K.J. Parsons, Anders Riggs, A.J. Coneth, A.C. Kitchener, S. Harris, and Haoyu Zhu. I don't know how badly I mangled all those names, or some of them at least. But the idea is that they were looking at urban foxes in England and basically closely analyzing their skulls. And they were taking them from a few cities in southern England, and they were finding that the urban ones seem to have shorter snouts, broader faces, and these are changes that we see when animals domesticate, like a dog versus a wolf, let's say. Smaller. Did I mention the smaller brain cases? They're in there too. Now, I should have looked up the name of the guy who did it, but there's a study like in the 20th century where a guy, I think at a fox fur farm started selecting foxes and breeding foxes for tameness, and then found that some physical traits came along with what they thought were just selecting for tameness, but they started having different shapes and heads and stuff. And looking more,
their ears started drooping more. Like I saw there's a documentary about it. It was really interesting.
Yeah, and in this paper, they're talking about skull morphologies, but they're also talking about ear floppiness, which I loved as a term, a technical term. So you get more ear floppiness. And so it seems like, that foxes in English cities at least are starting to, or have they're more careful than I am being in the summary in how they phrase this. But I'd say, maybe you're starting to evolve a little differently to look a little bit more like domesticated animals. It seemed like a good sort of concept to wind up with and chat about. I mean, are foxes on their way to being, in 200 years or 1,000 years is a lot to think about, but a few hundred years, will we have pet foxes like we do have, pet dogs and cats? Or in a more conservative kind of question, if they're evolving to look more domesticated, will that change how we think about them? What do you think when you think, oh, the foxes are getting cuter?
How could they get any cuter? I actually, when I was working on my picture book, I had to find reference of foxes in motion. I was living in West Philly at the time, and we didn't have any foxes around. And I found it interesting, one, that the local zoos don't have red foxes. Because they're just like, that would be like having a raccoon. Like the Philadelphia Zoo does not have a red fox. I think there's one in Delaware that might have one, or Norristown might have one. But they're not common in zoos because they're not exotic. They've become so common. And the other thing is that, so when I was looking for reference, I used YouTube, as I often do, and looked for people's videos of foxes that they taped, that they recorded in their yards. And I found some very charismatic fox pet owners out there. There are states that do allow you to keep foxes, and they're bred to be domesticated. And there was one that I was using his videos a lot to just get like really good fox in motion playing and whatnot. Very interesting.
I've seen
like the sounds they make are very interesting. The way they talk to their owners is different. Is that what you can say, Christian?
Well, I have two things. I want to follow up on the fox story. Here's a totally. This may be a completely apocryphal story, but a friend of mine in California, Malibu, I want to say, tells me that they have coyotes in town who don't howl as much as coyotes would normally do, but instead have chosen to bark. Mm-hmm. And they speculate that this is, I mean, of course, they're dogs. They have the entire sort of vocal range of dogs. Coyotes can bark just like regular dogs. But their impression was, very casual impression, that these coyotes would sort of figure out, well, we're in town and people don't seem to be upset by dogs as much as they are by us. So we're going to just make more dog noises. It sounds way too intentional to what's going on, I'm sure. But it's an interesting story, I think. So if only to emphasize the fact that domestication is a two-way street, right?
Yeah.
On the foxes, there's a sort of notorious, famous, infamous, depending on your position about these things, fox family in the Adirondack Provincial Park, not Adirondack, Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario, sort of a couple of hours north of Toronto.
Is this where you guys go for vacation sometime?
Yeah, so wildlife photographers have been feeding this family of foxes for generations, I want to say, for decades. And, you pull up in your car, the foxes start showing up. And they start begging the way that dogs will beg for food. They'll play the whole sort of register of domestic dogs. The beseeching eyes, the starving little puppy falling down. I have pictures of this. It's amazing. I mean, they've clearly figured out how to manipulate people into giving them food, and will behave in the way that your domestic dog will behave. I mean, to the point, well, that if you sit there, they'll jump into your lap, and sort of try to find the food in your pocket.
That eye contact part.
Sorry?
I was just going to say, point out that eye contact part is something that gets cited a lot when they talk about domestic features of dogs versus wolves. Is the sort of
is the lack of that? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the I don't know. I mean, clearly, yeah. There's a pet trade in foxes. I know people who have pet foxes, and they're not as reliably domesticated as sort of dogs, right? There's a wider variation. Some individual foxes turn out to be as easy to handle as any domestic dog. Other foxes are a little bit more difficult, a little more easily stressed, or never figure out where they have to pee and go potty and that sort of stuff. But the potential for domestication is there. Like if people wanted to do this systematically, I don't think it would take 100 years. It would probably take, a couple of decades, really. If you started a breeding program, that could happen quite quickly, I think.
There's a lot of reasons I'd like a time machine, but I'll add this to the list to see what foxes look like in a few human generations. There'll be many fox generations, and maybe enough for these traits to set in.
Synanthropic organism.
I want to thank Kate and Christian. Kate, what do you have a website where people can go to? How can people find the books that you're doing?
The easiest way is go to penguinart.com. It's easier than trying to remember how to spell my name.
Okay.
That's my website, and I have links to buying the books on my website. But they're available on Amazon and everywhere that you can buy books.
Awesome. I'm actually holding The Secret Life of the Red Fox right now. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
And Christian, any projects to mention on the way out?
Yeah, we're doing, at the moment I'm sort of writing about urban horses.
Oh.
Donkeys, yeah, in the West. There are a couple places where there are feral horses and feral donkeys that live in urban/suburban areas. And so that's our next project, trying to figure out how that works.
Wow.
Yeah. In Nevada, a couple places in Nevada, rural Nevada, that have where there's horses, and the Tano Merino Valley in the sort of inland Southern California, which is the epicenter of the U.S. logistics industry, warehouses, air pollution, tens of thousands of trucks, and a legacy herd of about 300 wild burros that sort of roam over the landscape and visit people's backyards. So that is a fascinating geography there.
I look forward to reading that, man. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's going to be a fun. There's a draft of the paper. I'll send you a copy. But we had been meaning to do the field work this summer, and obviously that didn't happen.
Of course, yeah.
Maybe in the fall, but we'll see.
Hey folks, if you liked this episode, please rate us highly on your podcast listening app of choice. Please tell all your friends, family, neighbors, everybody else about us, and feel free to email us with ideas or comments and suggestions at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com, tweet at us at urbwildlifecast, and of course check out all of our wonderful Wildlife Observer Network sibling podcasts.